off to Hawaii. Mark's destination was California. He was disturbed about his abrupt departure from Virginia City, but he was comforted by the belief that he was carrying a suitcase containing shares of his mining stock, which made him, on paper, worth a fortune. Much of his stock had been given to him by friends. It was the custom in Virginia City for a prospector to pass out shares of his latest claim to friends. Mark, with his capacity for making people like him, has accumulated a large number of shares in various mines. In San Francisco, he went to the finest hotel and spent his money lavishly. He lived as befit a young man who was worth a fortune in silver. Every day the stock market showed that his investments were soaring. He was getting richer and richer. Then suddenly the figures began to drop. They went down faster and faster. In a short time he had lost everything. His fortune had existed on paper alone, and when he had paid his hotel bills, he had exactly $50 to his name. He was 30 years old and he had nothing to show for his years. He had set out to make the world know his mark. He had planned to go exploring on the Amazon. He had prospected for silver and he had worked for newspapers and he had been the admired envied pilot of a Mississippi steamboat. As he now looked at his past, he asked himself what in really he had accomplished. Nothing. He had no money and no fame. No one knew the name Sam Clemens or Mark Twain, save a few miners who would soon forget it. He was merely another down and out miner with a story of past riches that were gone. He was like other has-beens he had once pitied, written about, and thought of no more. Depressed though he was, San Francisco fascinated him. It was a fabulous town founded on the profits of catering to gold miners. It was in 1848 that James Q. Marshall had discovered gold at the site of a sawmill he was building for John Sutter in the Sacramento Valley. In no time at all, the 49ers were pouring into California. San Francisco grew fast as a boom city, and its riotous and lawless Barbary Coast was infamous throughout the nation. Finally, members of the community took the law into their own hands. A committee of vigilantes was formed. People who set out to suppress violence and lawlessness until a regularly established government could take over control. When the gold rush started, the California Territory had already been agitating for statehood. In 1850, it was admitted to the Union as a state. 4 years later, the great gold bonanza began to dwindle and the state began to settle down to an ordinary progress toward a reasonable, sane existence. When Mark Twain arrived in San Francisco, the city was well on its way to becoming one of the most distinctive cities in America. The glorious view across the bay, the profusion of flowers, and the rapidly expanding city appealed to the young men. Here were palaces the rich had erected on the heights of the city. Here were elegantly dressed men and women. Here, too, were men of culture and discernment. discernment. Steve Gillis and Mark were soon working for the San Francisco Morning Call. Mark as a reporter, Steve as a compositor. But Mark soon discovered that greed, graft, and corruption were just rampant here in San Francisco as they had been in Virginia City. He longed to expose the worst element of the city, but he found he could not always be as outspoken as he wished. As the weeks passed, his interest waned, and he realized that he would not be able to launch his attacks openly as long as he worked for a San Francisco newspaper. Finally, Goodman agreed to take him as the San Francisco correspondent for the Virginia City Territorial Enterprises. Immediately, Mark launched a series of articles in which he poured out all his loathing for the corruption in the San Francisco government. Naturally, those he attacked were not pleased, but they bided their time until they could get something on him. Mark was warned again and again, but he continued his article. Mark's friend Steve Gillis was arrested and Mark went bail for him. Steve, hearing that he would not have a fair trial, fled from San Francisco, and Mark was held responsible for Steve's jumping bail. Mark knew he would not get fair treatment from the authorities, so on the advice of friends, he too left town and went off to hide out with Steve's brother Jim, the man who owned the cabin where Mark stayed were miners. As he watched the pocket miners panning gold every day, Mark's dream of making a fortune returned. He watched the men patiently put dirt through a sieve and retrieved the nuggets that were left after the dirt had been washed away with water. He forgot all his old resolutions and tried this new way of mining, but at last he was once more convinced that any type of mining was hopeless for him. Back in San Francisco, a change in the official dome made him position better, and he again went to work for Goodman's paper. But his restlessness made him dissatisfied, and he was soon looking about for new territories to conquer. He had gone, he thought, as far west as he could go. He was backed up to the Pacific Ocean now, but even an ocean wasn't enough to stop Mark Twain. Soon he was formulating plans to make a trip to the Hawaiian Islands, then called the Sandwich Island. He would write a series of newspaper articles to pay his way. On March 17, 1866, Mark Twain boarded the Ajax and started across the Pacific. He had an arrangement to write 4 letters a month for $20 apiece. He had his passage on the Ajax free, and he was going 2,000 miles to an island paradise. Kamehameha V was the king of the islands, grandson of the great Kamehameha, who had unified the islands and established a strong, vigorous dynasty. The arrival in 1820s, over 40 years before, of missionaries had changed conditions on the islands. The use of human sacrifice, the strong, powerful, often cruel feudal system which had grown up and the undisputed power of a minority over the vast majority of the people were at an end. The Hawaiians were said to be a good natured, courteous, happy people, and their present ruler, an enlightened monarch. Education was on the move. Before the arrival of the missionaries, the Hawaiians had had no written language, all their history and customs having been handed down from generation to generation by a few specially trained men. But the missionary had produced a vocabulary and arranged to have books printed. Now the Hawaiians were becoming part of the modern life of a 19th century. Sam's first sight after a 2100 miles sea voyage was the view of Diamond Head rising out of the ocean. Then Waikiki Beach came into view, and finally the famed coconut trees and the shining white town of Honolulu. It was like a vision of paradise. Everywhere were blankets of flowers and tapestries of bright green shrubs standing over the lazy sea and misty surf were great shining trees. Oranges, pineapples, bananas, strawberries, lemons, limes, mangoes, guavas, and melons grew in profusion. Hawaii was like nothing Mark Twain had ever seen, and it was everything that he had always dreamed a foreign place should be. Pearl Harbor, with its strange, lush tropical beauty, seemed to him the most beautiful, peaceful place in the world. The mode of life in Honolulu was a revelation. There was no hurried scramble for money. Rather, people moved slowly, enjoying food and friendship and spending hours outdoors enjoying the natural beauties that surrounded them. Mark Twain found that he worked freely, easily, and much of the ten, tenseness, tenseness that haunted him in San Francisco now left. He contemplated with a detached view the corruption he had witnessed in the West that had worried him for months. All his interest was kindled. He busied himself going everywhere, trying to see everything, writing about the experiences and sending off his articles. One of the things that he most wanted to see was the great volcano of Kailua. The crater was reputed to be 10 miles in circumference and in some places over 1,000 feet deep. Mark Twain started after dark and went up the side of the crater. He could see the glare from the fires and smoke clouds rising above the volcano. In the crater itself there were flames belching tongues of fire. The guides refused to go further, but Mark Twain was determined to see everything. A stranger approached and volunteered to show him the way. The stranger, who introduced himself as Marletti, said he knew a path across the crater, and the two skipped over the hot floor and over the red crevices with brisk dispatch and reached the cold lava safe but with pretty warm feet. Mark later wrote, when they got near the boiling fire, he thought they were in a gloomy desert and suffocatingly dark one, surrounded by dim walls and that seemed to tower to the sky. Suddenly, Marley shouted, "Stop!" Mark Twain needed to say no second command. Marley said they were off the path and that they were in the midst of beds of rotten lava. If they took a wrong step, they might plunge 1,000 feet through the ash to their deaths. At that point, Marley moves gingerly forward and went crashing through the ash and disappeared to his waist. Considerably shaken, he managed to get out, and the two men crept forward carefully. The lava surface was all alike in the lantern light. Mark Twain wrote, the Marley said it was not the lantern that had informed him that we were out of the path, but his feet. Marley had noticed that the lava needles made a peculiar grinding sound underfoot, and now he put the light behind him and searched with his feet instead of his eyes. When he did not hear the peculiar grinding sound, he knew he was on the right path again. The two men reached the north lake of the volcano after a long hike, and the glare was so blinding that it was some time before we could bear to look upon it steadily. It was like gazing at the sun at noonday, except the glare was not quite so wide. At unequal distances all around the shores of the lake were nearly white-hot chimneys or hollow drums of lava, 4 or 5 feet high and up. Through them were bursting gorgeous sprays of lava gouts and gem spangles, some white, some red, some golden. Mark Twain was completely worn out by the time he got back to Honolulu, and he was advised to take a rest or he might suffer serious effects from all his strenuous endeavors. While he was resting, the survivors of Hornet ship disaster came in. The Hornet had burned at sea, and the survivors, with rations for only 10 days, had been at sea for 43 days. An open boat with 15 men, more dead than alive, drifted into the harbor of Honolulu. The 4,000-mile voyage that had taken them to Honolulu and crashed most of them. Mark Twain insisted on getting up from his sick bed and interviewing the survivor. He was too ill to go on foot, but his stubbornness won the day. He had himself carried on a stretcher to see the survivors. Then he interviewed each, rushed home, and wrote all night the story of that fateful trip, finishing just in time to get the packet with his news aboard the Ajax. His vivid, sympathetic tales of survivors and his impassioned account of the disaster, as well as the fact that he had been the first to get the news back to America, made him famous. All the dispatches had originally been sent only to two papers, the Union of Sacramento and his old friend Goodman of Enterprises. The most of the important papers in America picked up the stories. Readers all over the country became familiar with his name. He was in Hawaii altogether 5 months. When he returned, He decided to lecture on his experiences and he hired the San Francisco Opera House for his talk. He bought newspaper space to advertise. Admission $1. Doors open at 7:30. The trouble begins at 8. He was absolutely certain no one would turn up, and he went to the hall in a mood of deepest despair. He was flabbergasted to find that the auditorium was jammed. His lecture was a great success, and all the San Francisco papers reported his triumph in detail. After this, one evening, he decided to arrange a lecture tour through the West. He lectured for 3 weeks in California and Nevada, and he made over more silver at humorous talk than he had ever made in mining. But finally he felt the time had come for him to return east. He took a boat for New York, and the trip was one of terror and tragedy. Cholera broke out shortly after the boat left port, and there were many burials at sea. But disregarding personal danger, he volunteered his services and helped nurse the sick.